Perhaps I should announce at this time, while everyone is settled quietly, that there will be refreshments after the lecture this morning. We have a new art exhibit in the library, and of course, we're going to have an important production this afternoon. The film will be shown, as indicated on the program, at approximately 2 p.m., but the gentleman who is presenting it to us will give a discussion of the film and interesting matter relating to it beginning about 1:30 p.m., so we hope that you will all be able to be here. This morning we have a very intriguing subject that has come into strong focus in recent years. Up to 10 or 15 years ago there was very little communication, ethically or psychologically, between the kingdoms of nature, but in the last few years the film industry and television have brought into very sharp focus the problems of ecology, and have given us a deeper, a more sympathetic understanding of the problems of animal life. Many of these films are tremendously significant, and should be of great meaning to really thoughtful persons. They all sum up to one basic concept, namely that one life vitalizes everything that exists in nature, and that this one life is shared by all the kingdoms of nature. That man does not have a unique control of universal life force. It is distributed to the great and the small, to the complicated and the simple, and tremendous pressure of this force continues, age after age, bestowing life and finding innumerable ways of perpetuating itself. In the Western world the animal has never had, generally speaking at least, the attention it deserves. From the very earliest records of Egypt, Chaldea, Babylonia, Greece and Rome, we hear the stories of the great hunters that went out to hunt animals, that these hunters considered hunting a sport, while some of the lesser people realized that it was essential to their survival. In a great many instances, at even very ancient times, in the West especially, hunting was a privilege. No one considered the animal, and the hunter was rewarded for an achievement which actually was no achievement at all. In most cases the animal had no solution, no answer, no defense against the inroads of human cunning and skills. We have to look a little around to see what we can find out that would help us to understand the importance of this particular subject, especially at this season of the year. Then let us consider where the animal has been best understood, and I think we must admit that that has been among Asiatic peoples. This does not mean that the Asiatic does not also forget the philosophies and religions that he has received, but generally speaking the understanding of animal life has been more explored in Hinduism and in Buddhism than in any of the Western philosophies and religions. These Eastern faiths have included animals in the concept of the universal plan of things. Occasionally, a Western mystic has done the same, and we remember how Saint Francis of Assisi preached to the birds, and we know that at certain rituals of the year in the church animals are given special attention, and animals are brought together for baptism. This is part of an old tradition, but it's not very widespread in the West. To the Westerner the animal is still something that really doesn't count. A few domesticated animals with which we have had long and intimate association have very good friends among humans. People have given a great attention to animals, but it has been as a result of a personal affection, a companionship, a sympathy that has been brought into existence by the needs of the human, and by consideration for the rights of life in general. In the East, however, in the Oriental countries, it was carried to a still greater extreme, especially, I think, among the Buddhist peoples, as their philosophy is essentially derived from Hinduism. The philosophy of animals as is taught in the Oriental systems perhaps is as good a key to our present relationship as we can find anywhere in contemporary life. Back in the 7th century, one of the Japanese emperors issued an edict against killing animals for any reason, and in order to support this edict he also had to consider those who made a living from hunting for food. He subsidized them. This particular program was expanded in the reign of the next emperor and then in the following empress, and during this time fishermen were paid to not to fish. Persons involved in all forms of animal activity upon which they depended for a living were compensated for the state, so as not to find it necessary to kill animals. At the time, the first American consul general was sent to Japan. The first thing he asked for when he got there was a beefsteak. This practically caused an international crisis, because no Japanese at that time had any idea of that type of eating. Of course, as soon as it was voiced about what the consul general wanted, it followed that every farmer hid his cattle. No one wanted to be the one to sacrifice his dear friends, his four-footed brethren, for this particular purpose. Finally, however, the government was able to buy a cow, which was killed and served to the consul. As a reminder of this, after the incident a monument in the memory of the cow was raised in Japan, and it was listed among the martyrs. We don't expect anyone to go quite that far, but it is still true that the effort was made definitely to prevent any sport hunting of animals, or any torture or abuse of them. The farmer and his oxen were brothers. They worked the rice paddies together. When the old ox passed on finally of old age, a little monument was built to its memory in the corner of the farm, and from that time regularly a little offer of food or incense was placed upon the altar. This was a relationship that we know nothing about practically as Western people. We do have people who will do anything they can possibly do to take care of animals well, but in the large pattern of things we haven't been able to achieve this degree of humanity. Today the Western civilization, especially America, is probably the greatest meat-consuming country in the world. This means that actually the American people eat more meat than probably any other nation can afford, and as a result of this the physical cost of meat is rising rapidly. For some time, there's been a suspicion floating around that this was not entirely a good idea, even entirely apart from the effect upon animal life, that it was not a good idea for the human being to eat a large amount of meat, that this led almost inevitably to physical ailments, had a tendency to shorten life, and that it was a mistake to assume that meat was the source of strength. It might give some assistance or physical stamina to those in very heavy physical labor, but for the most part, excessive meat eating is detrimental to health and has a certain effect upon psychology. The individual is less sensitive, less considerate, less integrated as a person, less kindly, sympathetic, and understanding as the result of a heavy meat diet. It is therefore perhaps something we should all remember, namely that it is not necessary for the human person, the human being, who is by nature a predator and a carnivore, to indulge these habits as much as he does. After all, behind all of these things there has to be a philosophy of some kind, and the problem of the meaning of it all has interested a great many. Probably the outstanding vegetarian in Western philosophy was Pythagoras of Samos, and from him have descended a number of groups who have refrained from animal food. The Neoplatonists of Alexandria wrote extensively on abstinence from animal food as being a very important factor in the unfoldment of the inner, superior factors and facets of human consciousness. In the Orient it was assumed, and I think this is perhaps the basis of a great many thoughts, that all living things form one family. The Oriental nearly always refers to an animal as his little brother, and assumes that as some mysterious, invisible power in space protects human beings. So in a sense, at least man is the god of the kingdoms below his own. The man is therefore the god of the animal and of the vegetables, and all plant life, and also of the mineral world. Now the Oriental is concerned with the simple fact that all of these kingdoms are alive. The idea that some of them only appear to be alive, and if they are alive it doesn't count, was entirely contrary to the convictions of most Oriental peoples. It was also contrary to the conviction of probably one of Western man's greatest horticulturists, Luther Burbank, who was perfectly aware as he said that while man has 5 sensors, plants have as many as 20 sensory perceptions. But they are different from ours. They live in a different world, and to them our world is a strange, often wicked place, where ghosts and demons threaten their lives, as we believed in the Middle Ages that ghosts and demons threatened our survival. In many instances we are ghosts and demons to the members of the lesser kingdoms. I remember Mr. Thomas Seaton told me a very interesting story. He said that the mysterious influence of man in the life of the animal is far greater than we realize. Animals, under normal conditions if attacked or hurted, will run to the human being for protection. He tells the story of a hunter who was hunting deer, and finally found this deer and was on the verge of shooting it when the animal ran and took shelter beside another hunter, who was also armed with a gun. But the animal believed in some mysterious way that the second hunter would not hurt him, and the hunter was so affected by this episode that he persuaded the other man not to kill the deer, and it went with him for a long way through the forest. The animal certainly has a strange respect for the human being, and in Buddhism, we have a number of interesting parallels of this. We are told that Buddha not only incarnated as a human being, but incarnated in some form in each one of the kingdoms of nature, and became the protector and guardian of that kingdom, and that each kingdom has the equivalent of a great spiritual teacher assigned to it, and that this assigned creature takes the form and body of that animal or plant, lives with it, but has mysterious psychic ways of communicating with it, and assisting it with the unfoldment of its nature. Most of these people are very particular on this particular subject. I know that even now in the monasteries and temples of Japan birds and animals are constantly present. Some have felt that these presences have been a little detrimental to the temples, but the old priests who guard the temples they would rather by far be a sanctuary for life than worry about the effects of it on the architecture. So they feed them, take care of them and guard them as members of a family, and when they die they are buried with a Buddhist ritual. This would all seem very fantastic to Western man. He doesn't think of these things at all, but then what explanation does he really have for the animal world? The films that we are seeing constantly now reveal the tremendous complication that exists in all the kingdoms of nature. It is inconceivable. The wisdom, the skill, the mysterious life power that is able to produce the many lenses of the eye of one housefly. Everything that lives is a mechanical masterpiece, and sold by a vital principle. Even the most humble thing is alive, and the life that is in that thing has mysteriously manifested every type of form and condition that we can imagine. Thousands of plant forms, some of them so wonderful and beautiful that they are breathtaking. Thousands of minerals of all kinds and types hidden within the earth, yet every one of these minerals is a chemical masterpiece. It has coloration, it has vibration, it has existence. It is alive. There is nothing dead in the world, except a stupid human being. Everything else is alive, and because it is alive it has responsibilities, and it has privileges, and the search for the privileges that living things have is becoming more and more engrossing to modern man. We are also beginning to realize that the gradual destruction of the proper grazing environments, the disfiguring of our environment and the various pollutions that are coming along, are not only endangering human life but are endangering defenseless life. Life that has no way of protecting itself against the aggravations of mankind, and out of this perhaps we are looking for an answer. What has science to tell us about how life creates the feathered structure of a bird's wing? Or how does it give us the full understanding of the tremendous involvement and complexity of a small garden worm? These things science cannot explain. They do not know how and why these creatures exist. The only thing we can do is catalog them, analyze them as to their structures and functions, and try to list the peculiarities, and in some cases what we regard as valuable byproducts of these forms of life. We do not know anything about the life in them, any more than we really know very much about the life in ourselves. The Oriental thinker simply brings it back to the Pythagorean hypothesis, namely that there is only one life. This totality of existence we call life. It involves not only the kingdoms of nature that we see and appreciate, but countless forms of invisible life. This one life involves the planets and the stars, involves everything that exists in the universe. There is life there, or if it was not there it could not be diffused or distributed throughout the structures of living creatures. Where this life comes from we are not too certain. Some have assumed that the source of it was the sun. Others assume that the source of it was nutrition. Some believe that it comes from some strange remote process of space that we do not as yet even comprehend, but that this life is as undeniable, and that this life is a strange moji power, that this life ensouls forms, and even creates forms, multiplies them. This same life destroys them in the course of time, or transforms them into other forms of life, but always one tremendous life energy ensouls the universe. The Oriental thinker, working with this particular problem, could only finally come to the conclusion that this eternal life everywhere, this omnipresent, omniscient, omniactive life, was definitely an attribute of God. Therefore the life in anything is the God in that thing, and that life and that God in that thing is the most powerful potential mystery of all time, because it reveals the divine power in the process of eternal creation. Eternal renovation. A constant maintenance of the various forms of life on all the levels of this universal system. We have this therefore as a thought, namely, that there is a life. That this life perhaps we could as well as not term God. If it is not God it is certainly a primary manifestation of deity. As we study this life more and more, we realize that it contains within itself a very wide diversity of energies, powers and specializations, and we must finally agree with the Chaldeans that this life energy is intelligent, that this force is not a blind force. It is not something that simply fuels things, like the gasoline in a combustion engine. This life is the only fuel in the universe that repairs and restores its own mechanisms, and not only that but extends them, complicates them, perpetuates them. It is not only a fuel process, it is a survival process, and within it an infinite manifestation of intelligent specialization. Every form in nature is geometrically perfect in its own right and power. It is composed of innumerable lesser parts, cells, atoms, everything brought together in a magnificent compound, and the power that installs this compound and creates it has to be the only one thing that exists, universal life. This universal life therefore seems to be locked into a sunray, and when the light of the sun strikes us, it is not simply a way of giving us a quick tan, or by giving us a certain amount of vital resistance. It is a process by means of which the infinite complexity of the human body itself is variously vitalized, and this life that comes from the sun is distributed to an infinite series of manifestations. We can see it in a meadow where one light ray descending from the sun maintains 100 forms of plants, flowers, trees and shrubs, each one receiving that which is necessary to itself, each taking that one life and molding it and modeling it to the needs of its own existence. This situation is so remarkable that it would seem that it would make a theologian out of every scientist, because there is simply no way of explaining this without assuming a universal intelligence at the source of life, and that this universal intelligence is omniscient. That it is capable of extending itself into every conceivable specialization that has existed, does exist, or ever can come into existence. The Orientalist working on this basis has come to the simple conclusion that there is a direct responsibility between forms of life, in which in each instance a superior form is responsible for that which is less evolved than itself. Each superior is in a parental relationship to that which is less mature than its own structure. Therefore, every form of life, according to Eastern thinking, is responsible in some degree and in some way for the protection of other forms of life that are less advanced or less specialized. Of course, the Oriental points to the mind. The human mind is a specialization. It can only exist because it is an aspect of a divine mind. That which is not mind cannot produce mind. There has to be the seed of mind in the infinite or it cannot be made manifest in man. But this mind begins to give man proprietorship. It gives him an understanding of life. It gives him a way of measuring and estimating the natures of lesser things. It reveals to him something of the majesty of space, and it also gives him an understanding of the millions of forms of life in a few drops of water. This mind then, as a contemplator, as a considerer of all things, has within itself the power to serve and protect forms of life that otherwise are not able to protect themselves. So the human being, while he does not need to be fanatical on the subject, has also to bear in mind that he is a gardener in the garden of the Lord, for he was placed in a garden to take care of it, and therefore he is responsible for all of the types of life that are in that garden. He's a good physician. He is the kindly friend. He is the one who protects the garden against weeds, and also in one way or another, ultimately protects the weeds from themselves. All the way down through this mystery of life then, we have this one tremendous vitality, a vitality that informs things, and when we destroy a living thing, we take away from it the body and the vitality. We leave the vitality homeless when we destroy the form in which it is naturally supposed to exist. Because the life of things is infinite, there is no possibility of man destroying life itself. What he calls a destruction is to remove it from manifestation in a given form or in a given structure. Death is merely the transference of life, from an objective to a subjective existence. It has nothing to do with the continuity of life itself. This is something that the Oriental has also given great thought to, and has tried to use this as a means to understanding the mysteries of the animal kingdom. Through the films and through the various media that have been developing recently, we have developed the concept, or become aware of the concept, of the food chain, in which everything seems to live from everything else. Every form of life survives upon some other form of life, and from the lowest to the highest conditioned forms of life are nutritioned by the lives of other forms. This has caused considerable sorrow and worry to those who love animal life, because it seems as though there is no way of preventing life from surviving upon life. This may not be quite as serious as we think, for the simple reason that we are now dealing not with a life that is passing from one thing to another. We are dealing with a life that is everywhere, always. That the only thing obliterated or removed is the vehicle of that life, but the vehicle itself is not the life, nor is the life destroyed by it. The Indian and East Indian philosophers have always assumed that animal creatures have an immortality the same as all other creatures. Even plants and minerals have a kind of immortality. This is different from anything we understand, but it still exists. Therefore, what we are really saying is that we are surviving on various levels from the bodies and vital instruments of other creatures, but the vitality itself, the source of it, the principle of it, is indestructible, and the lives of the various creatures are carefully measured, weighed and estimated by natural law. Let's say for a moment then that we want to understand this a little clearer. We have at the moment under consideration 4 types of life that exist in this material environment that we see: the mineral, the plant, the animal and the human. Scientists are trying desperately to make man merely an animal, and that the 4th kingdom consists of all vertebrates such as man, and that therefore man is simply an animal that has grown up a little more, and has become a little more dangerous by the way. This, however, does not meet the requirements of most classical thinking. The Darwinian theory is very objectionable to most serious thinkers, because it fails to take into consideration that we are dealing with 4 separate kingdoms of life, 4 waves of life, and the Brahmins, with their cosmal theology, have carefully described, differentiated and studied these 4 waves of life. In other words, the minerals are of a kingdom in themselves. They are a unity within a greater unity. All minerals have certain vibratory keynotes in common, and they are all under the control of what might be called a mineral entity. In other words, there is a parental mineral principle that guards, unfolds, and protects all mineral structures in nature. Very often these structures are served further by a series of invisible beings, who were regarded as nature spirits in antiquity. But the mineral has a complete structure in itself. There is one mineral, manifesting through an infinite diversity of mineral types, and subtypes, and divisions, and subdivisions. But all minerals are one complete entity in itself. The deity or god of the mineral is the protecting power of the total mineral archetype. We can call these guardians archetypes in Western thinking. They are the overshadowing totalities of their kind. Underneath or within the structure of such an archetype we will find subtypes, each with their own rulerships, until actually the government of a kingdom of nature is almost a complete cosmic theology in itself. All different forms of life are under certain general rules and orders. The second form of the kingdoms, the plant kingdom, also has its own archetype. It has the development of all forms of plant life. They are all specializations within one total plant energy, and this energy in turn is a specialization within the total life power of the universe. The various types of plants are like races within or upon the continent of plant integration. There are all kinds of subdivisions, as there are subdivisions of races among human beings. There are different kinds of plants, each with a different purpose, and some of these plants, as the scriptures tell us, are for the healing of the nations. Each plant has its rules and its laws and belongs to its own kingdom, and the subdivisions of that kingdom are all under an archetypal plant energy, a conscious mental plant integration. The third one of these is the animal kingdom, and in referring to these overshadowing principles, they are often called the group spirits. These group spirits represent the total guardianship of the animal kingdom. They are the archetypes within which all animals are differentiated, and in which each type of animal has its own subdivision and its own organization and life purpose. These inner divisions within the substance of a kingdom are no two of them alike, nor are any two of them on the exactly the same level of manifestation or integration. Therefore, within the animal kingdom there is a ladder, so to say, an ascending order of animals. In the plant kingdom there are ascending orders of plants, and in the mineral kingdom there are ascending orders of the vibratory rates of mineral structures. The animal constitutes therefore a complete world of itself. It has within it all types of animal life, from those which are the most primitive to those which are the most highly organized. The animal world, being a world which has sensational existence, can move and can propagate by various means. The animal has a larger field of activity. This field of activity affects the animal structure in a number of ways. It affects especially through the horizontal spine. The energies of the earth pass horizontally through the animal kingdom. In the plant kingdom they pass vertically from below up, and in the mineral kingdom they are diffused. In the human kingdom they descend vertically from the top down. Therefore all living things are divided by these orders of energy implementation. Animals from the lowest to the highest present many phases of interest to the individual. They are gradually unfolding what might be termed the emotional content. The animal lives on what we would term an animal level, and we very often think of that as an emotional level. The animal's emotional life is variously influenced by circumstances around it, but we see gradually unfolding through the animal most of the potentials, most of the basic divisions, which are later to appear in the human being. We find the animal with territories which it defends. We find animals gradually becoming more and more protective of their young. We find animals that have tremendous intelligence and in many ways appear to be practically human in their intelligence. Among the animal kingdom, of course, the highest among the animals would certainly be the elephant, which incidentally is one of the largest mammals, the largest land mammal that there is, and is a complete vegetarian. The elephant has tremendous skill in memory, and there have been many very authentic accounts of the peculiar ability of elephants to estimate human behavior. They are also said to be the only animals with a sense of humor, and among other things they must have it because they are the only animals that can laugh at human beings. I remember a case in India, near the city of Jaipur. I went on an elephant ride, up to an old palace that had been long deserted. Among those riding on the howdah was a lady with a very elaborate flower-strewn hat. I noticed the elephant had his eye on that hat, even before the ride started, but it was very docile and had a twist at the corner of the mouth, around the tusk, which looked very much like a leer of some kind. As we went up the hill towards the old palace, suddenly or slowly the trunk of the elephant came slowly up behind its ear, and it worked its way up until it could reach that hat. Without seeing the hat, it was able to pluck it right off the lady's head, and then the trunk stretched out and raised high, swinging the hat, and with grunts and roars the animal went the rest of the trip waving the hat. No one can say that that animal did not have a sense of humor. Animals like the elephant also are remarkably intelligent. It is believed from rather careful exploration that they actually have a religion. That they do perform some type of religious rites. It is also certain that they have leaders among their own kind who are very, very wise, and that the wisdom of the elephant is not merely a superstition, but is very much a fact. If you watched elephants in Burma piling teak, you would realize that you have very thoughtful animals. They are not only able to pile these teak trunks in good form, but having made a little pile, they will go back several feet, look it over carefully, and then come back and square up a few logs that were out of position. They do all of these things, and they are also in many respects a very gentle and docile animal, unless they are abused. Here is an animal that is a very highly intelligent one. There are others also. Among the fish, the dolphin has been proverbial, known to the Greeks, and also one of the earlier symbols of Christianity. We find many of these creatures having powers that we do not understand or know. The reason why they have these powers is because every creature has them latently, but to certain types of animals, birds and fishes, necessity forces the specialization of growth. In order to survive in their own environment, or to fulfill their own purposes, they have to have a chance to develop, or have to intuitively release from within themselves the powers necessary to their own survival. Birds that have to migrate 5,000 to 10,000 miles are given the equipment to do it. Bats have an inbuilt sonar system. I remember in one of the caves down in New Mexico, they stretched wires across the mouths of the caves from which the bats came at night, the idea being that in the dark the bats would run against these wires. When the time came and the bats came out with a 100,000, not one of them touched a wire. They had their built-in protection, and though they couldn't see the wire, they instinctively avoided it. All these different specializations have been variously mistaken as being something that was leading up to humanity. That the animal was on its way up to being a human being. In a sense, this is correct, but not in the Darwinian sense, and not in the sense that we have generally thought about it. The next kingdom, of course, we consider as the human, which has existed for a very long time. The earliest known examples of humanity were still human, and before that we have very little record to go on to find out what man's original development was, but we may suspect, as in the case of many religious philosophies, that these kingdoms were not completely products of evolution but were created. They were fashioned or created to form an avenue for the release of a great current of divine energy, and they were brought into manifestation in order that energy might gradually diffuse itself through every atom of space. The human being therefore has been endowed with certain factors and faculties, which in many instances rather closely resemble animal propensities. They may seem to look very much like it. There are types of very aboriginal human beings from which it is difficult sometimes to be sure that they did not develop from one of the higher anthropoidal animals, but they did not. The human being is a great wave in itself. It is one of the four great orders of life that we have here on this planet. It was created human, but in the early phases of its development, it may have appeared or resembled very closely the lower kingdoms of nature. The Brahmins built much of their philosophy upon embryology. They were very astute students of the formation of the fetus in the human body. They were able to estimate, therefore, that the evolving embryo gradually passes through similarity to practically all of the previous forms of life. At a certain period in the development of the human being, there is no essential, noticeable or visible difference between the prenatal state of the human being and the prenatal state of the life in an egg. The egg is born at a certain time, but the human being is not. It continues on to pass through other stages of modification, and I think that to the Oriental mind especially these different orders of life are degrees of organization through which life passes. When each life reaches the maturity of its own kingdom it is born, and from the very earliest time this birth is always controlled by the kingdom to which the creature belongs. Therefore the animal entity is born sooner than that of man in the development of the internal structure. This doesn't mean the time is necessarily shorter or longer. It means that the degree of development of the structure to receive energy is longer in the more advanced forms of life. The human being therefore really is an isolated creature in it. In this human being is evidence of all other kingdoms. The vegetable, the mineral, the animal, are all there. In the body the creature has built up a form structure which is to become finally its power. From the beginning, although it may have resembled so closely animal forms in its development as to deceive the superficial observer, there was never a time in which the human entity, as it was evolving, was not of a kingdom of its own, belonging to one order of life in particular. These four orders of life therefore are said to extend through what is called a day of manifestation. In other words, the days and nights of Brahma are really great divisions of time, millions of years in which the earth comes forth itself from the divine egg, manifests its manifestation and power, and finally retires again into sleep. Every form of planet, sun, star, galaxy, and all the black holes and everything else, all are born, unfold and gradually fade away into the night. For life is a pulsation, and the pulsing of a great psychic cosmic system may require thousands of years for a single beat of that pulse. In any event, the point to make is that periodically creation and manifestation goes to sleep. In this process of sleep everything is suspended. All forms of life remain in quietude, and when this time comes, nothing suffers. Nothing hungers. And to enter into this sleep is no more painful than to go to sleep oneself at night. A great suspension of life occurs periodically to constitute the days and nights of Brahma, the period of the great Manvantara. Actually, when this happens, the kingdoms then change. It is when the great night of Brahma settles, the transition from one kingdom to another takes place. The evolution of life is therefore that the mineral life passes to a plant consciousness. It takes on a plant dimension, but only in the intervals between the days of manifestation. Then the new plant which was a mineral begins an evolution that may last for many millions of years until it completes that cycle. If by some chance, a plant, an animal, or a human being for that matter, becomes more highly advanced than its kingdom, in other words, if an animal reached the point where it was practically human, where it had practically every attribute of a human being, according to the Eastern philosophy it still cannot make its voluntary or spontaneous transition into another kingdom. If it really reaches the point where it has outgrown its own kingdom, then it passes into a trance state, and remains in this suspension until the end of the day of the manifestation, and when that next day starts, then it emerges into the next higher order of life, but it cannot go back and forth between orders of life during a living pattern cycle. This transition is only possible at certain given and appointed times, when the entire organization of the solar system passes through its step forward by the great clock of universal time. When this actually occurs, then we will find that the animal kingdom will attain what we would consider to be the human state. We say, considered, to be the human state, because according to the Brahmins, who were the only ones I guess to set up the complete geography of space, they have done psychologically and intuitively far more than Western science has ever been able to achieve, but they did it in a way in which only they can understand it, because the Western mind will not accept it, but according to these old systems that seemingly are about the wisest that we possibly know at the present time, the various changes that take place are all orderly, proper and reasonable, and in these great change cycles, various forms of life move forward into another level of manifestation. There's something of this in the incarnations of Vishnu, the avatars and so on, in which the avatars Vishnu recapitulates, symbolically, the 10 lunar months of gestation. Everything is on one grand plan, but it is very difficult for the analytical mind, that doesn't have some theological resource within itself, to attempt to explain these very abstract subjects. The ancients also affirm that these various rounds or levels of evolution are constantly changing, and that therefore these various levels do not continue from on our level. Man has become a human being on the physical level of nature, but the next day of manifestation will not be on the same level. Therefore, when the time comes for the animal to become human, or its equivalent, it will occur in what we call the etheric plane, or the akasha. It will be a different dimension, a different world, a different level. To us it would be ether and invisible, but when the living things emerge there and become part of it they're just as physical, just as real as anything here, but it will be much more attenuated, much more subtle, subject to a great deal more psychic investigation, and when the animal does attain its human state it will be higher than the human being of today, but that cannot be until it has completed the cycle of its proper growth and manifestation. In ordinary walks of life, how are we going to handle the problem of surviving and helping animals to survive under existing conditions? The Oriental mind is very tolerant, much more probably in most respects than we are. Everything is taken into consideration. One of the immediate considerations is to determine if possible the degree of consciousness possessed by an animal. If an animal had exactly the same inner life as man it would have conquered the earth long ago. The tremendous outlying of animal life, the tremendous mass of insects, fishes, birds, mammals, reptiles, had this organization been capable of a historical viewpoint on existence, it would probably have taken over long, long ago. The reason probably is, as far as we can figure now, that the animal has not done this because it lacks one peculiar faculty which man possesses, and which apparently it does not possess, and that is memory. If it was not for the lack of memory, if the animal could remember the past and think of the future, if the animal could organize a continuity of existence within its own nature, it would be indestructible. That is, it could not be overcome by any other kingdom, but as a result of a peculiar statement or condition it does not have this proclivity. Years ago I talked about this with a professor at the University of Berkeley, and he said to me, "You know, I would give 10 years of my life if for 5 minutes, I could experience the consciousness of an animal. It would solve something that is apparently not to be solved by any means that we know, but the Oriental approaching the subject solved it on the grounds that the animal has no continuity of a realization or of purpose. The animal during life has great affections emotionally. It can be evolved and involved. It can pass through tremendous modification through contact with human beings. The family pets, the animals that are loved, appear to return that love with all their hearts and souls and become indispensable friends in a family, but what is lacking is the intellectualization of that relationship. The animal has certain cunning, it has certain skills, it has certain reflexes, but the tremendous drive that is in the human being, the drive to master, to control, to dominate in its normal relationships, this drive is not specialized or developed or individualized in the animal. As a result of the lack of this continuity, animal existence is not nearly as difficult as ours. It's not nearly as much of a problem as ours. Again, we can take another value of the point, namely that the mineral is said to be in the dimension unconscious, as far as our understanding is concerned. The plant, as well as we understand it today, is in a dream state, and the animal is in a trance state. This trance state means perhaps that the animal sees life largely as we would in a dream, or in a vision, and the animal does not have therefore the complete individuality that the human being has. Furthermore, all animals being suspended from one animal entity, one basic archetype, the animal being. The Kabbalah refers to man as being a progeny within the structure of Adam, the primordial man, the total which is the archetypal. There is an archetypal primordial animal, and the life of the animal is within this, and the animal's instincts, appetites, attitudes, processes, are all held together by one great archetypal pattern. When the animal dies it is not like an individual dying, because the form is dropped, but the archetypal pattern is not changed. The animal dies back into its own race, kingdom or kind, rather than being separated forever as an individual. So the probabilities are, as far as we can learn, that the food chain is not as brutal as we might think it is. We cannot assume that the divine plan would be brutal. We cannot divine or assume that a terror would be imposed upon all life by a benevolent power. We just could not assume that this would be true, and in nature it probably is not true, because of this fact that we have the archetypal form behind which is the real living thing, not the animal itself. Another problem that comes in, that maybe we should try to give a little thought to, is the future of animal life in this world. The animal life cannot cease. It will have to continue, but it will have to continue with various adjustments and adaptations, and the adjustments and adaptations to animal problems are the same as the adjustments and adaptations to human problems. We are all here for one essential purpose, and that is to unfold the potentials of survival. This we have to very carefully watch. In the animal kingdom, for instance, we have another factor that regulates life that we do not have, having invented a solution to it. The particular point we want to make is that animal life is controlled as to its length and its condition very largely by teeth. An animal's teeth are the secret of its lifespan. If an animal's teeth wear down, as they always will ultimately, it is unable to handle food, it cannot hunt, and it cannot chew the hard gristle and bone that most carnivores have to face, so all carnivorous animals are subject to the decline of their own teeth. Seaton told me one day, and he was a very good naturalist, probably one of the best of his generation, that no animal is recorded as having died a natural death, except perhaps in a veterinary hospital. An animal does not die a natural death. It is the victim of the enfeeblement of itself. Its teeth go. It loses its power to digest food. Then it is unable to defend itself and gradually loses its leadership in its own kingdom and is simply removed. This is apparently part of nature's plan. Man is the only animal that perpetuates the unfit. Nature doesn't do this. It seems very cruel and very hard, but if we recognize that in this universe there is no end of anything, no termination and no destruction, we have to realize that these transformations are parts of a plan. Our main duty in the connection with animals is to be as thoughtful and kind, and attentive to their needs as we can be. It is a mistake, however, as several naturalists have observed through experience, to try to take away from an animal all of its natural attributes. It is not wise to take an animal, domesticate it and then turn it loose, because it can longer survive in the world of its own affairs. The world of experience helps the animal to grow suitable for its own survival. We have the same problem on the human level. We cannot overshelter a human being through childhood and early life, and then expect it to go out and become strong. It is necessary for things to live according to their laws, and it's when we attempt desperately to change these laws that we get everyone and everything into trouble. The plan of things as it is a workable plan. It is our problem to conserve it, to do everything we can to make the plan easier for everything involved in it, less painful, less dangerous, less complicated. But if we go to the degree where we interfere with normal processes in an effort to frustrate the natural laws governing the archetypes of the various kingdoms, we are almost certain to get into trouble. The fact that we have vandalized the mineral world is giving us trouble already. We are worried about the inability of the vegetable or plant kingdoms to continue to maintain the aggressiveness of human life. This again is something they'll have to face. Also, we are concerned that gradually pasturage is going to disappear, and there will be no way to take care of an animal population, and therefore that the animal as a food factor will probably have to be eliminated. We have all, many of us at least, lived to see one major step forward in animal economy, and that is the development of the automobile and the truck. In the olden days, animals were brutally treated by thoughtless, careless, and heartless drivers. Today, most horses are either at pasturage or being trained to become racehorses, and the average value of a horse has risen from a few dollars now to as much as $500,000. No horse would ever remember or realize how expensive it has become, and how aristocratic it now is in all the luxuries and favors that are given to it. But gradually we have gotten away from the brutality of the old handling of animals. The same is true in the veterinary system. We are becoming more and more aware of animals' sickness. We do everything we can to prevent pain to animals, and in many ways we are succeeding in protecting and improving their life condition. This process should continue as far as possible, because through it we are going to learn a great deal about our own lives and the conditions through which we will also pass in the course of evolution. Most religious books have not said much about animals. In other words, there's been a great question as to whether there's a heaven for animals. The only people, strangely enough, who have allowed certain animals to enter heaven have been the Muslims, because they have selected certain animals associated with the religious life of the people, and these animals are now sacred and are allowed to enter heaven. For the most part, however, we have never thought of a heaven with an animal population. The Buddhists, however, would not consider that to be an unreasonable or fantastic state of affairs, but they would point out that with the animal in its own kingdom, with its own archetype, with its own deity, with its own life force moving through it, actually its own afterlife state is completely organized according to its own kind, in its own need, and that every animal will have the same right to rest and peace and growth as the human being has, but it will be a little different type of thing than from what we are acquainted with. At the present time, it being very close to Easter, there seems to be something else that we might mention that would be very important to think about. We remember that the Eucharist, or the sacrament of the blood of Christ, has long been an essential of religion. A Holy Communion is one of the sacraments of the Church. It is supposed to be what is called the most beneficial of all sacraments, whereas the baptismal rite is the most necessary. In this particular instance, the Eucharist, or the final consummation of the sacrament, is that we take the blood in the body, and represent the body and blood of Christ through wine and bread, and that in taking this, we are sharing together the Eucharist of universal life. This is perhaps nearer to a truth than we realize, although we have only dogmatized it in its own way. Actually, we recognize Christ as a major aspect of deity. We recognize Christ as the Redeemer of mankind, and the blood of Christ as this mysterious energy, this life that flows in all things. Any act against life is therefore an act against God. Any misuse of life is a form of blasphemy or heresy. Every living thing is sustained and supported by the life of the divine power. The lower kingdoms are supported, but they do not necessarily know why, because as far as they are concerned, even the scriptures tell us they are without sin. There can be no sin in that in which there is no recognition of good or evil. The animal is not governed by vices and virtues. It is governed by immutable laws of its own kind. Therefore, it cannot sin, but man, with the right of choice, the right of discretion, the right of differentiation, as St. Thomas Aquinas points out, is responsible for his own actions, and not only do we think it this way, but we have to realize that our own actions are dependent upon the life which vitalizes those actions. There can be no action apart from life, and man is the only creature that we know in our environment that is aware of the source of its life, and is aware of the use or abuse of that life. All destructiveness, therefore, is an abuse of one life. There are not several different lives that we can choose between. There is only one immutable divine force originating in the divine being. This one immutable force gives life, vitality, energy and opportunity to all living things, from the lowest form of atom or molecule to the highest of all cosmic structures. This one life therefore is what we live of, from and by. This one life is the only reason we are alive. Without it, we could not even exist. Every word that we say is made possible by that one life. Therefore, if we say that which is not true, we are abusing that life. Every mood that we have is that life. And therefore, if the mood is unpleasant or unkind, we are misusing energy. The same mood, the same life has made all things around us alive. To intentionally destroy, or hate, or condemn, all of these emotions are a blasphemy against the one life which is the life of all men, and the light that comes to all is the light of the world. In all kingdoms, mineral, animal, plant, man, there are these energies which are differentiations of the one life of the divine power. In God we live and move, and have our being in the divine energy fields of existence. We have the source of our existence here and now. If it was not for that source of life, we could not have a doubting Thomas. If it was not for that life, an atheist could not proclaim his unbelief. Everything that we do, good, bad or indifferent, is the result of our use, abuse, misuse of this one great life power. Some of it comes to us from the sun, some from the stars, some from the luminaries, some of it comes from the earth beneath our feet, and more comes from all the things that grow out of the earth. But everything that is merely a manifestation of the one life which was given to all living things for their own perfection, and for the perfection of each other in the infinite scheme of things. We have to a degree a constant participation in Holy Communion. We have a constant part in the transubstantiation of the host. We have a very definite part in the mystery of the Pentecost. We have a mystery in which life, a mysterious, intangible thing, utterly beyond definition, makes all definable things possible. Of this life we may or may not ever have a full knowledge, not certainly in our present level of development, but we can recognize that which we cannot understand. We can realize, if we think a minute, that this life is the one fuel in space. If we waste gasoline, we are going to be in short supply. If we waste this life in ourselves in the process of doing this wasteful thing, we damage the channels in our own nature by which this life can reach us. Through the perversion of things, through alcoholism, through narcotics addiction, through all kinds of misuses of the body, we cut off its supply of life. We cannot cut it off completely because it is a channel, and through this channel, millions and hundreds of millions of little lives within ourselves are sustained. The life that is our composite life breaks down into the energy necessary to maintain every cell, every atom, every electron, in our complex constitution. Therefore, if we destroy and betray and shut off the proper circulation of our own life energies, we commit within ourselves something like a terrible earthquake, or a great flood, or a great disaster. But with our collapse of our own intelligent use of energy, all the billions of parts of ourselves must suffer also. Therefore, we in a strange way are a god to the cells in our own body. We are also teachers and parents, not only of our human families, but of the animal kingdoms and of the plant kingdoms. In Japan, the flower arrangement procedure is an effort to glorify this concept of using the flower to teach part of the mystery of life. We also can be very thoughtful. I think the time is long past when anyone should feel the happiness or achievement of hunting. This is something that is not necessary. We should never destroy life unless that destruction is absolutely necessary. In that it is what nature itself tells us. It never kills for fun. It never kills for pleasure. It never kills also in experimentation and things of that nature, and vivisection is something else that must gradually fade out. All of these misuses not only damage the animal-human relationships, but they coarsen human nature. The individual loses something of the fineness of himself, something of the nobility of his own emotions, when he participates in the destruction of life, and if this is true of all of the animal kingdoms, how much more true is it of mankind itself? Here we have a great world, 4.5 billion human beings. From the beginning of time, war has devastated the nations of the earth. War is a supreme misuse of energy. But if we misuse energy long enough, if we misdirect our resources and gradually use universal life to destroy, we shall bring down upon our own heads the vengeance of heaven, because, as the Oriental also says, karma, bad karma, is nothing more or less than the result of the misuse of our divine potential. Good karma is the right use. One is as real as the other. In every misuse of energy among ourselves, among other peoples, among other creatures, we must recognize, as Buddha tells us, that in every area of life effect follows the cause as the wheel of the cart follows the foot of the oxen. Therefore, the happy person is the one who uses energy and uses his vital resources not only constructively, but almost with a ritualistic realization of the sacredness of the life by which he is sustained. We should all try, in every way that we can, to reduce suffering and sustain life and use properly the divine resources. If we do that, our time will be long and happy in the land which the Lord God hath given us. Until then, we're going to be in a moderate degree of trouble. Well, I guess that's all for this morning.